At 62, John Kelly felt as though his world had shrunk to the size of his old, creaky house in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. 3 years had passed since Alice, his wife, his other half, had gone, taking all the colors of life with her. Cancer had proven to be a merciless artist, slowly but surely erasing her features until all that remained of the vibrant portrait was a pale, faded sketch in his memory. Now, John's life was monochrome, like the old newspaper he mechanically flipped through every morning at a local cafe called The Morning Light. He would arrive at 7 sharp, order a black coffee and a toast with jam, sit at the same table by the window, and watch the small town wake up. He knew every passer-by by sight, but he greeted no one. The words would get stuck in his throat, turning into a lump of unspoken sorrow. A former bridge engineer, he had spent his life connecting shores, forging paths where there were none. And now he himself was on an island of loneliness, cut off from the entire world by an invisible river of grief. His hands, accustomed to blueprints and calculations, now aimlessly handled old tools in the garage or mechanically fixed things that weren't broken. The house, which he and Alice had built together, pouring their love and dreams into every board, had become a mausoleum. Her armchair by the fireplace, her collection of porcelain birds on the shelf, her half-read book on the bedside table, everything was frozen in time like exhibits in a museum of a single, irretrievably lost life. His son, Matt, was living his own life in sunny California. He called once a week on Sundays, and their conversations were short and strained. "How are you, Dad?" Same old, son. Take care of yourself. You too." John felt the chasm between them, a chasm he himself had dug over the years spent at work, in the eternal pursuit of something important that, as it turned out, was not there at all. He had missed the moment when Matt turned from a boy into a man, and now he didn't know how to build a bridge across that chasm. Faith, which had once been a pillar of support for him, had also crumbled. As a child, he had been a diligent Catholic, attending church regularly with his parents. Alice, with her quiet but unwavering faith, had kept that flame alive in their family. But after her death, the church became a place where the silence screamed of his loss. He looked at the crucifix and saw only suffering, not hope. God was silent, and John stopped talking to him. An emptiness, cold and all-consuming, filled his soul like a dense fog with no clearing and no landmarks. One rainy autumn evening, as the gray sky wept along with his heart, John was sitting in the attic, sorting through old boxes. He came across a family album with a worn leather cover. Flipping through the yellowed pages, he looked at faces frozen in happy moments. Here he was, with Alice at their wedding, young, full of hope. Here was Matt, taking his first steps, his arms amusingly outstretched. Here was their family trip to Niagara Falls. Every photograph was a stab, both sweet and bitter at the same time. Between the pages he found an old, slightly faded postcard. It depicted a majestic cathedral, its Gothic spires reaching for the sky. Santiago de Compostela, Spain. On the back, in Alice's familiar, slightly slanted handwriting, were the words, "Someday we will walk this path together. Your Alice." John froze. He remembered that evening. Alice had come back from her book club, her eyes shining with excitement. She told him about an ancient pilgrimage route, the Camino de Santiago, which thousands of people had been walking for centuries in search of something important. 800 kilometers on foot across northern Spain to the relics of St. James. At the time, he had brushed it off, citing work and a lack of time. "Some other time, darling," he had said, and that some other time never came. The postcard in his hand felt heavy, as if it held the weight of all the unfulfilled promises and missed opportunities. John looked at the image of the cathedral, and in the depths of his scorched soul, something barely perceptible stirred. It wasn't a decision, not a plan. It was a vague, almost irrational impulse, like a call he couldn't explain. To walk this path, to walk it for both of them. Perhaps there, on the dusty roads of Spain, he could hear Alice's voice again, not just in his memory. Perhaps there he could find something to fill this ringing emptiness. Or maybe he would simply feel alive, feel the pain in his feet, the wind on his face, the fatigue in his body. Anything but this numbness. Not knowing why, not knowing how, John suddenly knew that he had to do it. This path was the last thread connecting him to Alice, and perhaps the only chance to find himself again. The idea, born in the silence of the dusty attic, began to take root. John, a man accustomed to planning and calculating everything, for the first time in his life gave in to an impulse. He sat down at his old computer and typed into the search bar, Camino de Santiago. The screen lit up with photographs, endless trails disappearing over the horizon, ancient stone bridges, the green hills of Navarre, the golden fields of Castile, and people. Different people from all corners of the world, with backpacks on and staffs in hand, their faces tired but inspired. John read the stories of pilgrims, as they called themselves. Some walked to fulfill a vow, some to overcome a loss, some simply for adventure. And each one found something of their own on this path. 800 kilometers, 500 miles. The number was intimidating. He was 62. For the past few years, his physical activity had been limited to trips to the garage and walks to the cafe. His knees creaked in the morning, his back ached from sitting too long. Could he do it? The thought of failure was humiliating. To imagine himself returning home after a week, broken and defeated, was unbearable. He decided to consult his neighbor, Bill, a retired postman with whom he sometimes exchanged a few words over the fence. Bill, upon hearing John's idea, twirled his finger at his temple. "John, are you out of your mind? 500 miles. At your age, that's for the young and healthy. You'd be better off buying yourself a new fishing rod and sitting quietly by the lake. What do you need Spain for?" Bill's words were like a cold shower, but to his surprise, John felt not disappointment, but stubbornness. His neighbor's skepticism only strengthened his resolve. Next was the call to Matt. His son listened, and a pause hung on the other end of the line. "Dad, are you sure? That's a serious physical challenge. Maybe it would be better to just go as a tourist, see the cathedral?" In Matt's voice there was concern mixed with skepticism. He saw his father as an aging, withdrawn man, not a brave pilgrim. "I can handle it, Matt," John said, more firmly than he expected of himself. He didn't explain about Alice, about the postcard, about the emptiness. His son wouldn't have understood. He simply said that he needed this. Despite all the doubts, both external and internal, John took the first step. He bought a plane ticket to Paris, and from there to Biarritz, the nearest airport to the start of the trail. As he clicked the purchase button, he felt a chill run down his spine. There was no going back. This was the most spontaneous and insane decision of his life. The preparation began. John sold his old rattling car, which spent most of its time in the garage. The money he got became his travel fund. He spent hours studying pilgrim forums, compiling a list of necessary gear. The most important item was the boots. He went to a specialty outdoor store and spent half the day there, trying on different models until he found a pair that fit like a glove. The salesman, a seasoned hiker, gave him a piece of valuable advice. Break them in properly before your trip. Your feet are your most important tool on the Camino. And so John started walking. Every day he put on his new trekking boots and logged miles around Lancaster, gradually increasing the distance. At first he was out of breath and had to stop every 10 minutes, but day by day his body got used to the load. He bought a backpack, a sleeping bag, a rain jacket, a first aid kit. As he packed his rucksack, he weighed every item. The pilgrims advised carrying no more than 10% of one's body weight. This meant he had to get rid of everything superfluous, keeping only the bare essentials. This process became a metaphor for him. He realized that for his whole life he had been carrying a huge, invisible backpack stuffed with unnecessary anxieties, resentments, and regrets. Now he had to shed that load. The day before his departure, John drove to the cemetery. He stood for a long time by the granite headstone engraved with the name Alice Kelly. He brought her favorite white lilies. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees, and for a moment it seemed to him that it was Alice whispering words of encouragement. He placed his hand on the cold stone. "I'm going, Alice," he said softly. "I don't know what I'm looking for. Maybe forgiveness, maybe myself. But I'm going, just like you wanted. We'll walk this path together." For the first time in 3 years, he didn't cry. In his heart, there was not only pain, but also a quiet, timid hope. He was not leaving Alice. He was walking toward her. He was embarking on this journey to find answers to the questions he was afraid to ask himself. He was afraid of the unknown, afraid of his weak body, afraid of loneliness. But the desire for change, the desire to feel alive again, was stronger than all his fears. Arriving in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port felt like entering another world. The small town at the foot of the Pyrenees, nestled on the border of France and Spain, was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. The narrow cobblestone streets were filled with people from all over the globe, dressed in hiking clothes, with backpacks on their shoulders. They spoke dozens of different languages, but their eyes all held the same expression, a mix of excitement, anticipation, and a slight fear. John, used to the silence and solitude of his home, felt overwhelmed and a little lost. He was a stranger at this festival of life. He found the pilgrim's office where he received his credential, the pilgrim's passport where he would collect stamps throughout his journey in albergues, churches, and cafes. A smiling volunteer girl handed him a scallop shell, the ancient symbol of the Camino. "Buen camino," she said. "Good journey." This phrase, as John would later learn, was the main greeting and wish on the way. His first night in an albergue, a pilgrim's hostel, was an ordeal. A huge room filled with bunk beds, the sounds of creaking, snoring, and whispering in various languages. John couldn't sleep for a long time, listening to this symphony of other people's lives and thinking about his empty, quiet bedroom in Lancaster. He felt old and out of place among these young, energetic people. What am I doing here? The question buzzed in his head like a persistent fly. The morning began before dawn. Pilgrims got ready in the semi-darkness, the rustling of sleeping bags and the zipping of backpacks filling the air. John stepped outside. The morning air was cool and fresh, smelling of damp earth and blooming plants. Ahead of him loomed the Pyrenees, their peaks shrouded in thick fog. The first stage of the journey was considered the most difficult, the crossing of the mountains. The first steps were hard. The backpack, which hadn't seemed so heavy at home, now pressed down on his shoulders with the weight of lead. The path went steeply uphill. Every step required effort. His heart pounded in his chest. His breath grew short. Other pilgrims walked around him, easily overtaking him, wishing him a buen camino as they passed. John felt like an old nag trying to keep up with spirited racehorses. He stopped more and more often, leaning on his new trekking poles and trying to catch his breath. Doubts began to gnaw at him again. Bill had been right. This was madness. Just when he was ready to give up and turn back, a woman caught up with him. She was short, with a short haircut of graying hair and lively, laughing eyes. She looked to be about 55. She walked with a light, springy step, despite carrying a backpack just as large as John's. "It's tough, isn't it?" she asked in English with a strong Italian accent, noticing his labored breathing. "The first day is always the hardest." John just nodded, unable to utter a word. "I'm Maria," she introduced herself, holding out her hand. "John," he managed to squeeze out. "Don't hurry, John from America," Maria smiled. "The Camino is not a race. Everyone has their own pace. Go as you can. The way will accept you as you are." Her words were simple, but they had the effect of a sip of cold water on a hot day. He straightened up and walked beside her. Maria turned out to be a teacher from Rome. She was walking the Camino in memory of her brother, who had died a year ago. He had always dreamed of walking this path, but never got the chance. "Now I walk for both of us," she said. "I carry his dream in my heart." They walked together, and Maria talked non-stop about Rome, her students, her family. Her energy and love for life were contagious. John mostly listened, occasionally inserting short phrases. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. The climb grew steeper. The fog thickened, turning into a fine, drizzling rain. But John no longer noticed the difficulties. He just walked, step by step, listening to Maria's voice and the beat of his own heart. He still didn't fully understand why he was here, but now he knew that he was not alone on this path. The first step into the unknown had been taken. The first few days on the path turned into a relentless battle with his own body for John. Every muscle ached from the unaccustomed strain. His feet throbbed, and despite the good boots, blisters began to form on his soles. In the evenings at the albergue, he, like dozens of other pilgrims, performed the sacred ritual, piercing the blisters with a needle and thread to drain the fluid and dry the wounds. The pain in his knees became his constant companion, especially on the descents. Sometimes he felt he couldn't take another step. But every morning he stubbornly put on his backpack and set out on the trail. The physical suffering receded into the background when he lifted his eyes. The landscapes of Navarre were stunning. Green, velvety hills covered with forests gave way to neat vineyards where clusters of future wine were ripening. The trail wound through small medieval villages with stone houses and narrow streets. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, damp earth, and smoke from chimneys. The ringing of bells from ancient churches echoed through the valleys, marking time not in hours, but in centuries. But solitude on the trail, when Maria walked ahead or when he wanted to be alone, brought him back to the past. Step, another step. The rhythmic movement put him into a kind of trance, and memories of Alice overwhelmed him. He remembered their wedding. She was in a simple white dress, and her eyes shone brighter than the stars. He remembered their first trip to Europe, how they, young and carefree, got lost in the streets of Paris and laughed until they cried. He remembered how she supported him when he had problems at work, how she believed in him more than he believed in himself. But other images surfaced as well. Arguments over trivial things that seemed so important then. His silence when she wanted to talk, his irritation when she asked for help. He suddenly realized with agonizing clarity how rarely he had told her about his feelings. He loved her, loved her madly, but he thought his actions, the house he built, the comfortable life he provided, spoke for themselves. He didn't understand that she needed words, simple words. I love you, I need you, I'm proud of you. Now, these unspoken words burned him from the inside like hot coals. He held endless dialogues with her in his head, asking for forgiveness, explaining, justifying himself. But the only response was silence, broken by the crunch of his boots on the gravel. Evenings in the albergues brought relief. Physical exhaustion washed away some of the emotional pain. The pilgrims, tired after a long day, would gather in the communal kitchens or courtyards. Over a simple dinner, pasta with tomato sauce, bread, and cheap wine, conversations would start. These evening gatherings became a window into another world for John. He listened to the stories of people who were strangers to him yesterday, but were now sharing their most intimate secrets. There was Lucas, a young programmer from Germany, tall and lanky with sad eyes. He was walking the Camino after a difficult divorce. "I thought our love would last forever," he said, staring at his plate, "and then it just ended. I'm walking to understand how to live on, how to learn to trust again." There was an elderly couple from Ireland, Sean and Mary. They walked holding hands, and their faces shone with a quiet tenderness. They were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. "We've been through a lot," Sean said with a laughing Irish brogue. "There have been joys and sorrows. The Camino is like our life in miniature. Sometimes the sun shines, sometimes it rains. The main thing is to walk together." John looked at them, and his heart ached with envy and longing. He would never have that again. One evening, by a fire lit in the courtyard of an albergue, he struck up a conversation with a young Korean man named Jin. His English was poor, but with gestures and smiles he explained that his father had walked the Camino 10 years ago, and it had changed his life. Now he was following in his father's footsteps to understand him and become closer to him. Listening to these stories, John understood that everyone has their own Camino. Everyone carries not only a physical backpack, but also an invisible burden of their losses, hopes, fears, and mistakes. And this path, this ancient road, in some incomprehensible way, united them all, making them fellow travelers not only in space, but also in time. He still felt broken and lost, but no longer so alone. The pain of others did not diminish his own, but it made it part of something larger, part of the common human experience. He was just one of the thousands of pilgrims who had walked this land for centuries, leaving behind traces of their pain and their hope. On the second week of the journey, the Camino decided to test John's resilience. The sky, which had been clear and sunny until then, became overcast with leaden clouds. The rain began. Not just rain, but a veritable biblical flood. It poured down in sheets, turning the path into a slippery clay-like mess. Every step became a risk. His feet slid, his poles got stuck in the mud. The rain jacket, which had seemed so reliable, was soaked through. The cold chilled him to the bone. John lost sight of Maria. With her light gait, she had moved far ahead. He was left alone with the raging elements. The wind threw streams of water in his face. Visibility was almost zero. There wasn't a soul around, only the sound of the rain and his own heavy breathing. And in that moment, despair washed over him, cold and sticky, like the wet clay under his feet. "What am I doing here?" he screamed in his head, trying to outshout the wind. "I'm an old fool. I should have stayed at home, warm and dry, not dragged myself thousands of miles to die of pneumonia in some Spanish backwater." Thoughts of returning home became obsessive. He imagined his cozy house, a hot coffee, a dry armchair. It all seemed so distant and unattainable. He was ready to sit down right there, in the mud, and just wait for it to be over, no matter how. Through the curtain of rain, he saw the blurry outlines of a small village ahead. Gathering his last strength, he hobbled towards it. In the center of the village stood a tiny, ancient church made of rough-hewn stone. The door was ajar. Without a second thought, John stepped inside. It was quiet, dry, and smelled of incense and centuries of dust. A dim light filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the stone floor slabs in muted colors. John took off his wet backpack and sat down on the back pew. He hadn't been to church since Alice's funeral, and now, sitting here, he felt mixed emotions. On the one hand, he was angry with God for taking his wife, for leaving him alone. On the other, he felt a desperate need for comfort, for a sign, for something greater than his pain and despair. Without knowing why, he knelt, just as he had done in childhood. He didn't know what words to say. The prayers he had once learned were erased from his memory, and so he just began to speak, in a whisper. He spoke of his pain, his emptiness, his fear. He didn't ask for anything, he just poured out everything that had accumulated in his soul. And in that silence, broken only by the drumming of raindrops on the roof, he felt a semblance of relief for the first time, as if a heavy stone had been shifted from his heart. When he stood up, he saw that he was not alone in the church. In a corner, near the altar, an old man with gray hair sat on a chair, dressed in simple peasant clothes. He looked at John with kind, understanding eyes. "A hard day, pilgrim," he said in broken English. John nodded. "My name is Miguel," the old man introduced himself. He was the caretaker of this church. They started talking. Miguel said that he had lived in this village his whole life. He had also walked the Camino many years ago. "Why did you walk?" John asked. Miguel was silent for a long time, looking somewhere into the distance. "My wife and I lost our son. He was in an accident. He was only 20. Our world fell apart. I didn't know how to go on living, and so I walked. I walked and I screamed at God. I cursed him. I cried. But with every step, with every kilometer, the anger left. I didn't get an answer to my question, why? There is no such answer. But I understood that I had to live on. For my wife. For the memory of my son. The way did not take away my pain, but it taught me how to carry it." Miguel's story shook John to his core. His own loss, which had seemed unique and the most terrible in the world, suddenly became part of a common human tragedy. He looked at the wrinkled but bright face of this old man, and saw not a man broken by grief, but a symbol of wisdom and incredible resilience. The rain outside began to subside. The sun peeked out, and its rays, breaking through the stained glass, played on the stone floor. John felt warmth entering his soul along with the sun. The crisis was over. He knew he couldn't give up. He had to keep going. Not because he was strong, but because he had to learn to carry his pain, just as Miguel had. This day, which began with despair, became a turning point for him. It was his first real conversation with God, and he received the answer not from the heavens, but from the lips of a simple Spanish old man in a small village church. After that day, something changed. John stopped racing, stopped fighting the way. He accepted it. He walked at his own pace, sometimes alone, sometimes with someone. He caught up with Maria again, and when she saw him, she hugged him joyfully. "I was worried about you," she exclaimed. They were joined by Lucas, the German guy. His sadness hadn't disappeared, but he began to smile, listening to Maria's incessant chatter. Soon, their small group grew. In one of the albergues, they met Clara, a woman in her 60s from the Netherlands. She had stern facial features and very sad eyes. She spoke little about herself, but it was clear she was carrying a heavy burden. And so their little Camino family was formed: the energetic Italian Maria, the melancholic German Lucas, the enigmatic Dutch Clara, and the quiet American John. They were all so different, but the way had united them. They began to walk together. They shared food, a piece of cheese, an apple, a handful of nuts. In the evenings, they cooked dinner together. They filled each other's water bottles at fountains. They took care of each other's blisters. They talked a lot, and they laughed. John had forgotten the last time he had laughed so sincerely, to the point of tears. Maria was constantly telling jokes. Lucas, despite his sadness, had a subtle sense of humor, and Clara would sometimes make such sharp and witty remarks that everyone would roar with laughter. In this atmosphere of warmth and acceptance, John began to open up a little. One evening, sitting on the terrace of an albergue with a view of the sunset, he told them about Alice. And then, unexpectedly for himself, he started talking about Matt. He told them about the chasm between them, about his guilt for being a distant father, always busy with work. "I don't know how to fix it," he confessed, looking at the dying embers of the sky. "I'm afraid it's too late." "It's never too late, John," Clara said quietly. "As long as we're alive, there's always a chance to fix things." Their path took them through Pamplona, the city famous for the running of the bulls. There were no bulls, of course, but the city was bustling with life. They decided to take a rest day there. They walked through the ancient streets, sat in tapas bars, drank local wine, and for the first time in many years, John felt not just like an observer, but a participant in life. He laughed at Maria's jokes, argued with Lucas about soccer, listened to Clara's stories about her garden in Holland. He suddenly realized that the value of life is not only in great goals and achievements, but also in these simple moments, in a shared dinner, in a friendly conversation, in a sunny day in a beautiful city. He began to notice not only the landscapes, but also the people. He saw kindness in the eyes of the albergue owners who welcomed tired pilgrims like family. He saw mutual help on the trail, people sharing Band-Aids, water, encouraging those who fell behind. It was a true fellowship, one that knew no borders, languages, or ages, the fellowship of the way. He still missed Alice. Her image was always with him. But now this grief was mixed with a new feeling: gratitude. Gratitude for her having been in his life, and gratitude for this path that she had given him. A path that had pulled him out of his shell of loneliness and shown him that the world was full of kind and compassionate people. He still hadn't found the answers to his big questions, but he was no longer alone in his search. His new friends, his Camino family, were walking beside him, and that gave him the strength to go on. The path led them through the wine region of La Rioja. Endless vineyards, bathed in sun, stretched out on both sides of the trail. It seemed as though the very air was saturated with the sweet aroma of grapes. But this idyllic picture brought John no joy. About halfway through his journey, a second, even more powerful crisis hit him. This time, it was not physical, but an emotional collapse. The physical fatigue had accumulated, weighing him down with a continuous burden. His legs ached as usual, but now apathy was added to it. He walked on autopilot, not noticing the beauty around him. All his thoughts returned to Alice, but now they were not bright memories, but dark, agonizing images of her illness. He remembered her fading gaze, her weakness, her pain, and he was overcome with guilt. Guilt for not being able to save her, guilt for being alive while she was not. One night in the albergue, he couldn't sleep. He lay on his squeaky bunk, listening to the snoring of his neighbors and staring at the ceiling. And suddenly, the dam he had been building inside himself for so long broke. Silent tears streamed from his eyes. He cried as he hadn't cried even at the funeral. These were tears of grief, guilt, helplessness, and self-pity. He got up so as not to wake the others and went out into the courtyard. The night was starry and cold. He sat on a stone bench and sobbed aloud, his whole body shaking. He thought that he was unworthy of this path. He was an impostor. He came here supposedly seeking spiritual enlightenment, but in reality he was just running from himself. He didn't deserve to finish this path, didn't deserve to reach Santiago. The albergue door creaked quietly, and Clara sat down next to him. She just sat in silence, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her presence was unobtrusive, but offered incredible support. When John had calmed down a little, she spoke. Her voice was quiet and steady. "I know how you feel, John," she said. "Many people on this path go through this dark night of the soul." And she told him her story. Many years ago, she had had an affair with a married man. She knew she was doing wrong, but couldn't break the connection. When his wife found out, she took her own life. "I didn't pull the trigger," Clara said, looking at the stars, "but I feel that her death is on my hands. I have lived with this burden for 20 years. I came to the Camino to ask for her forgiveness, and to try to forgive myself. That's the hardest part, John, forgiving yourself." Her confession stunned John. He realized that his sense of guilt was nothing compared to the burden this woman carried. Her story made him think about his own guilt. Yes, he hadn't been a perfect husband and father. But was he to blame for Alice's death? Was he to blame that Matt grew up and was living his own life? He realized that his guilt was more like regret. Regret for missed opportunities, for unspoken words. "Forgiveness is not an event, but a process," Clara continued, "step by step, just like this path." The next day, during a break, John took a notebook and a pen from his backpack. He decided to write a letter to Matt. Not to send it, but to sort out his thoughts. He wrote about things he could never say to his son out loud. He wrote about his love for him, his pride. He apologized for being so absorbed in his work that he had missed so many important moments in his life. He wrote about how much he missed him. He wrote for a long time, and tears dripped onto the paper, blurring the ink. When he finished, he felt as if a huge stone had been lifted from his soul. He folded the letter and put it in his backpack. He wasn't ready to send it yet, but the very fact that he had managed to put his feelings into words was a huge step forward. The dark night of the soul was over. The dawn was beginning. The landscapes around him regained their color and dimension. The sunsets over the vineyards of La Rioja no longer seemed to him a symbol of fading, but a promise of a new day. He understood that this path was not only a physical challenge, but also a journey into the darkest corners of his own soul. And to see the light, you first had to walk through the darkness. After the crisis in La Rioja and the conversation with Clara, John felt something shift within him. He stopped analyzing his feelings and simply began to live in the present moment. He enjoyed every step, every gust of wind, every conversation. He started noticing the little things: a lizard sunning itself on a rock, a snail slowly crawling across the path, the pattern of clouds in the sky. The way led them into Galicia, the final region before Santiago. The landscape changed. The hot plains gave way to green hills covered with eucalyptus and pine forests. The air became humid, and it rained often, but now the rain didn't bring despair. After the rain, everything smelled fresh, and a rainbow would appear over the hills. John noticed that he had started to pray more often. These weren't the rote prayers of his childhood. It was more of an internal dialogue. Walking along a forest path, he would talk to Alice, telling her about what he had seen, about the people he had met. He would talk to God, not asking for anything or complaining, but simply sharing his thoughts. He didn't call it faith. Rather, it was a feeling of connection to something larger than himself, to nature, to the history of this path, to the souls of the millions of pilgrims who had passed this way before him. His little Camino family grew even closer. They now understood each other without words. They could see when someone needed support and when they needed solitude. One day, Lucas had a breakdown. He received a message from his ex-wife and fell back into despair. He sat down on the side of the road and refused to go on. John sat down next to him. He didn't try to comfort him or offer advice. He just sat in silence, just as Clara had once sat with him. And after a while, Lucas got up, and they walked on. John realized he had learned not only to accept help, but also to offer it. In a small Galician village, they stayed overnight in an albergue attached to an old monastery. In the evening, they were invited to Mass in the monastery church. John hesitated, but Maria insisted. "Come on, John, it will be beautiful." The church was simple and austere. A few monks in white robes sang Gregorian chants. Their voices, blending in perfect harmony, soared under the vaults and seemed to fill the entire space, penetrating the very soul. John didn't understand the words, but the music spoke for itself. It spoke of eternity, of suffering, and of hope. And for the first time in many, many years, John felt a sense of peace. Not the silence of emptiness, but a peace filled with meaning and light. He felt that he had been forgiven, and that he himself was ready to forgive. After the Mass, he sat in the monastery's inner courtyard. The stars overhead seemed so close. He took the letter he had written to Matt out of his backpack. He reread it. Then he took out his phone. His hands trembled slightly. He took pictures of the letter's pages and pressed send. He didn't expect an immediate reply. The important thing was that he had taken this step, a step toward reconciliation. He felt that the bridge he had once built of steel and concrete now needed to be built from other materials: honesty, vulnerability, and love. The light at the end of his personal tunnel was growing brighter. There were less than 100 kilometers left to Santiago. The last few days of the journey were filled with a special feeling, a mixture of joy and sadness, joy from the anticipation of arriving in Santiago soon, and sadness that this incredible journey was about to end. There were more and more pilgrims on the trail. It was no longer a solitary path, but a wide river of people flowing in one direction. And then, finally, the day came. After climbing the Monte do Gozo, the Mount of Joy, they saw it. In the distance, in the morning mist, the spires of the cathedral of Santiago de Compostela were visible. Tears welled up in everyone's eyes, 800 kilometers behind them. John looked at the city of his dreams, of Alice's dreams, and couldn't believe he was here. He had done it. Entering the city was noisy and bustling, but when they walked out onto the Praça do Obradoiro in front of the cathedral, all sound faded away. The majestic facade of the cathedral, adorned with countless sculptures, soared into the sky. It was immense, beautiful, and seemed not of human making. Dozens of pilgrims were sitting and lying on the square. They were crying, laughing, hugging, praying. Each was experiencing this moment in their own way. John took off his backpack, sat down right on the stone slabs, and for a long time just stared at the cathedral. There was silence in his soul, not emptiness, but a ringing, fulfilling silence. First, they went to the pilgrim's office to receive their compostelas, the official certificates of completion written in Latin. Holding this document with his name on it, John felt a sense of pride. It wasn't just proof of a physical achievement. It was a symbol of his inner journey. In the afternoon, they attended the Pilgrim's Mass in the cathedral. The inside was even more majestic than the outside. A vast space, a gilded altar, the play of light filtering through the stained glass windows. The cathedral was full of people. During the Mass, the priest read a list of the countries from which pilgrims had arrived that day. When he called out the United States of America, John's heart skipped a beat. He felt part of this huge, worldwide brotherhood. The culmination of the Mass was the swinging of the Botafumero, a giant censer swung by 8 men in red robes. It flew up to the very dome of the cathedral, leaving a thick trail of fragrant smoke. This ancient ritual, once intended to mask the smell of unwashed pilgrims, had now become a breathtaking spectacle symbolizing the ascent of prayers to heaven. Watching it, John couldn't hold back his tears. He cried, and they were tears of cleansing. He felt Alice's intangible presence beside him. He felt a connection to the whole world, to God, to himself. After the Mass, he approached the altar where the relics of St. James are said to be. He took a small, worn photograph of Alice from his pocket, the one he always carried in his wallet. He kissed it and gently placed it in a crevice behind one of the pillars. It was his symbolic gesture. He wasn't leaving her here. He was letting go of his grief. He knew she would always be in his heart, but now he could live on, carrying the bright memory of her, not the heavy weight of loss. That evening, their little Camino family gathered in a restaurant to celebrate. They ate Galician delicacies, drank wine, and reminisced about the funniest and toughest moments of their journey. They exchanged addresses and promised to write. It was a sad and joyful meal. They had become so close, but they knew that tomorrow their paths would diverge. Late that night, back at the hotel, John saw a message on his phone from Matt. "Dad, I got your letter. I don't know what to say. Please call me. I love you." John dialed his son's number. When Matt answered, for the first time in many years, John didn't know what to say, but the words came on their own. "I love you too, son," he said, his voice trembling. They talked for a long time, longer than ever before, openly, honestly, without reproaches or unspoken grievances. They agreed that John would fly out to him in California as soon as he returned. This conversation was the last, most important step of his Camino. The bridge had been built. Returning to Lancaster was strange. The town hadn't changed. The house stood in the same place. But John was different. He looked at familiar things with new eyes. The silence in the house no longer felt oppressive. Now it was a silence filled with memories and new hopes. The first thing he did was go to the cemetery. He brought Alice white lilies again. "I did it, darling," he said, smiling. "We did it." Life began to take on new meaning. He called California and bought a ticket. He eagerly awaited seeing his son, his family, his grandchildren whom he barely knew. He wanted to make up for lost time. He started attending the local Catholic church, not because the dogmatic faith of his childhood had returned, but because he understood the importance of being part of a community. He joined the church choir. His voice wasn't the best, but he enjoyed singing with other people, feeling like part of a whole. One day, while sorting through Alice's old things, he found her gardening gloves and a packet of rose seeds. She had always dreamed of planting a white rose bush by the house. The next day, John dug up the earth by the porch, where the sun shone brightest, and planted the seeds. He often thought about the Camino. He understood that the path hadn't ended in Santiago. That was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life, a life where there was room for the sweet sorrow of the past, the joy of the present, and hope for the future. One morning, as he was watering his future rose garden, he felt a gentle breeze. He closed his eyes and smiled. It seemed to him that it was Alice whispering in his ear, "Buen camino, my love, buen camino." The journey continued.